Welcome back to Composition and its Allies. My name is Barney. I'm a classical composer, and this is a channel for composers as well as performers interested in composition. In today's episode of Orchestration for Beginners, I'm going to talk about over-orchestration, which is when you have too many instruments too much of the time. I find it's very, very common with beginner orchestrators. Let's begin. So this is the first version of my symphony that I composed in America. So this is before I moved to France to get proper training in harmony, as well as did some orchestration classes. Notice that the marking is pianissimo or piano in certain parts, yet we have all three groups utilized. We have the strings, we have the brass, and we have the woodwinds. Now, as we say in French, c'est pas impossible, okay? What that means is like, okay, in theory, that could work, but most likely it is over-orchestrated. So notice that the woodwinds, we have 3 out of 4 instruments being utilized. For the brass, we have 3 out of 4 instruments being utilized. And for the strings, we have 4 out of 5 instruments. Why do you need this many instruments if it is piano or pianissimo? Now, it is true. Sometimes when you orchestrate, you mark things up or down from what you actually want them to sound so that by making that effort, it will sound as you want. But here, I think there is a risk that the orchestration is going to feel a bit bland because when you have too many colors at the same time, especially for kind of, it's a restricted range as we see, it's not like a wide range. With a lot of unison, it's going to feel super saturated. So here is a piano reduction. So notice the woodwinds, okay? We have 6 woodwinds, but we're using some unisons here. So we have the clarinet and the oboe on a unison, and we have the oboe and the flute on a unison. I think this works really well on its own. So when you have the woodwinds and you have like maybe a 4-note chord, then you probably need 6 or maybe 8 woodwinds to cover all the partials because you don't want one instrument just on its own self. It'd be kind of strange just have one clarinet. So I think this works really nicely. Notice the brass, we just have 2 trumpets on a mute. And this can be fine for a delicate chord. However, notice that they are taking the exact same notes as the clarinets. Now, the clarinets in this range, if you listen, I think they work with the trumpet. But the question really is, what is this adding to the mixture? In particular, because we have, c'est précisé, it's in French, it's specified that we have piano or pianissimo. Then we get to the strings. Notice that we have 4 different notes to the chord, which are the exact same notes that the woodwinds have. And here the strings are divided. We have 3 different string instruments, okay? And we have the violin 2 divisi. And my question is, what is this adding to the chord? Also notice that we have violin 1, though it's half of them, okay, as well as viola just on that one note. So that might bring a little more strength or power to that note. And it may not be what we actually want, or maybe it is what you want. Another thing to notice is that we have that C in the staff, it's in the oboe, it's in the flute, it's in the trumpet, it's in the violin too. So that's a lot of unison for a piano passage. Is it really necessary? Notice as well that the A natural, which is kind of a special note, you know, it's an altered note here. It's the leading tone in case you're interested. Notice it's doubled in the clarinet, the trumpet, and the viola. So that it's kind of a tender note and it doesn't really make sense, may not be the best idea to have so much doubling. So as a consequence, I think this orchestration, in French you say l'orchestration plate, okay? It's going to feel a bit flat and dull because we just have too much of the same idea being repeated. So my first suggestion is to go to the source, make it super, super simple. Revision will be to just take out a group. So let's keep the woodwinds, take out the brass, keep the woodwinds, take out the strings, keep the strings, take out do something, but take out an entire group. Now let's talk about how harmony prepares you for orchestration. So in harmony, we're going to start with root position chords, and we only double the root except for the deceptive cadence. For deceptive cadence, we're going to double the third. So that's our first intro, and almost always the third. So that's our first introduction to like the differences between the third and the root. Later, when you'll move on to first inversion chords, but when you come back to revisit root position chords with more experience, you'll start experimenting with the third, you know, just for aesthetic reasons. And of course, when you go to orchestrate, then you have a plethora of possibilities for hearing a really rich orchestration. Now let's talk about unisons, doublings, and voice leading. So here I did a full piano reduction by groups, but I stacked it differently, so visually it's a little bit easier to see other aspects. So let's look for the melody. So we have the melody in the violin 1, we have it in the trumpet 1, and we have it in flutes à deux, so flutes at the unison. This is a lot for the melody, especially for a piano or pianissimo passage, but since it is tutti, you kind of have to do that. One thing that in French we say il faut signaler, okay, that I want to bring your attention to is notice that the two flutes at the unison paired with the trumpet with a mute at the unison. I think this is kind of a weak orchestration. I hear the pale flute sound doesn't really match the trumpet with a mute there. I could be wrong, that is subjective, but it is something to just think about when you have a lot of unisons. Now let's look at the bass. Notice that we have the bass in the cellos, but we don't see in any other group, right? The trombone, that doesn't have the bass at first. It's slightly above. This is going to be a problem for a tutti passage because we're not really going to hear the bass. I mean, it will be a little bit present, but I think the harmony is going to become very vague. In a video I did recently or end of last semester called The Line of Demarcation, I talked very specifically about the danger of doubling the bass in higher registers. So it's good to reinforce the bass down an octave, get a clear bass, but you also have to be careful about the overdoubling the bass. So for example, notice the cello says si la si, and then the clarinet in a higher octave is also doing si la si. So this could create what we call in French une orchestration lourde, okay, kind of a heavy, darker orchestration. Generally, it's advised not to do that. It's much nicer to have a clear, clean bass line and the upper parts do something completely different. It just usually, French would say une valeur sûre, means it's just going to work out the box. But it could be what you want if you want a gruffer orchestration, though most likely it's not what you want. So just double check that video, The Line of Demarcation, if you want more information about how to make sure you don't do an unnecessary doubling of the bass. If we look at the strings on their own, I don't see any problems. I think the strings sound quite nice. It'll be nice, rich texture. Notice that we have some tighter intervals in that third chord in the lower register, so that will be a very nice, dark, rich string sound. Okay, notice the brass. Okay, I think the brass look good except for the fact that the trombones are not on the bass. Now, this doesn't have to be a problem, but it feels like that first chord is a little bit undefined without the trombones on the proper bass note. That could be subjective though. Then when we get to the woodwinds, we don't even have the bass, which is not a problem. You don't want to have too much bass, of course. And the woodwinds seem to be, fine in and of themselves. So we have good or acceptable orchestration group by group. However, tutti, we do not have a really strong orchestration, and it's going to feel very dull and very flat because we have so much overdoubling, especially at the unison. In order for a tutti orchestration to really work, it's going to have to be louder, and if it was louder, you'd have to have it in multiple octaves, so we have richness. So my big suggestion again would be just cut out a group. So maybe just cut out the woodwinds and reorchestrate the brass and the strings. Maybe cut out brass and woodwinds, just have the strings and end the piece with the woodwinds, but really try to take out an entire group. So let's talk about how harmony prepares you for orchestration. So in harmony, you're going to have 4 voices, okay? Soprano, alto, tenor, and bass. That is the minimum you need to fully express tonal harmony, okay, until it gets too complex. So look here on the screen. So notice I have marked, okay, the bass here is the cello, the soprano is the violin 1. Then the violin 2 is doing the alto, and the tenor role is confined to the violas. So when you take the time to really invest in harmony, when you go to orchestrate, it becomes so much simpler because you know what's at the heart, what's at the root of everything. Now let's look at a revision. So this is the revised version I just did today to just kind of show you what you might do. But at the end of this video, I will show you the actual version that I did after studying in France and getting proper training in harmony. So notice I remove the woodwinds, okay? Sometimes just go big, go strong, just simplify, remove an entire group. Just don't even try to work with like a faulty premise. Just get rid of it, okay? Notice the strings that I changed the dynamic. So prior I had pianissimo, probably because I had so many instruments, I was trying to kind of relegate the sound. So obviously I was hearing that it might have been over-orchestrated, but I didn't have the ability to really see it in full. So now I just have them at piano, which is probably the actual dynamic I wanted. Notice in this reorchestration attempt that I added some more volume to the viola. So I added a lower partial just to thicken the sound. So when you have tighter intervals in lower registers, we talked about this in the recent full tutorial I did, which is called the orchestration of intervals. We talked about when you have tighter intervals in lower registers, it creates a thickness to the sound that is often undesirable, but can be done to really exploit certain properties of the sound. So here I'm kind of darkening this orchestration. Notice the brass. So we have the trombone is now doubling the cello, right? Notice I kept the trumpet on the melody. And notice that the French horn, the lower French horn, is doing concert Si, La, Si. So it's still a doubling of the bass, which I had pointed out prior might be create a dark kind of harsher orchestration. So sometimes when you're orchestrating, you have to accept certain faults, okay, or the nature of the chord, because it is a reflection of what the composer was thinking. So when I look at this older version, I can see, okay, the composer was hearing this doubling of the bass in a thicker, darker orchestration, so I don't want to change that too much. One other thing is notice I lighten up the last chord. So in that first orchestration, you'll notice that I seem to be an attempt to kind of get a little bit lighter for that last chord. And notice how I refined it in this first orchestration attempt. So notice that the violas kind of shift up to a higher register. So maybe I should add decrescendo as well. Notice the trombones as well. The upper one shifts to a higher register to kind of get a lighter sound, take away that heaviness from the chord. So how does harmony prepare you for orchestration? Again, this is what really allowed me to get this richer ear to kind of like take things out and hear, just cleaner doublings. So when you get to first inversion chords, right now I'm doing reposition chords for the Fundamentals of Harmony series, but when you get to first inversion chords, which we'll get to next semester, the six is the kind of sixth of the chord. You're going to usually double the sixth is what they say at first. But there are times we don't double the sixth. Sometimes you're going to double the third, especially for cadential motion, and sometimes you're going to double the bass, especially for a passing motion. So there's all these different cases, and it really depends on the context, and it's very laborious. It takes a lot of work, okay? So you got to get started now. But as a consequence, when you hear all the variations of the inversions and the placement, when you go to orchestrate, you just have a cleaner, fresher, just really supple orchestration. Now I'm going to show you the lighter orchestration version of the ending, and then very shortly I'm going to show you the actual version that I publish on my website. So notice in this first attempt, bare minimum. Okay, ask yourself, what is the bare minimum I need to get this effect? All right, so here, this is the bare minimum. Okay, again, I talked about, even though there's only 4 notes to the chord, with woodwinds, a lot of times you're going to have to use unisons. And clearly here I wanted this kind of mixture tone of all the woodwinds, okay? Or the upper woodwinds. In this second possibility, notice I kept the woodwinds, but I added the strings in the background, but as concertino, so I'm hearing this kind of atmospheric effect. Of course, this depends on what is preceding it. If I have the strings before and the woodwinds before, then it's going to be a loss of freshness. And then this final possibility, notice that I'm experimenting with, I took out the clarinet and replaced it with the trumpets on mutes. This is an effect that I'm very curious about. I've tried a couple of times in my symphony. Help Us on the Way for Orchestra, where the trumpet is being used and heard and conceived of as a woodwind instrument. It's supposed to blend with them. I'll let you know after the performance how well it goes. But as a reminder, when it comes to orchestration, though it is good you want to get better orchestration, there's another battle that you have to think about, which is getting that performance. I'd like to show you the final version or the current version of my symphony, which I reorchestrate after getting proper training in harmony, as well as orchestration classes in France. But I just want to remind everyone that we do have a competition that deadline is coming up very soon. And for this competition, you just need to choose a passage from your first orchestral work that you'd like to revise. You got to revise it. Very small passage is fine. Fill out the application. It will take some time to fill out the application. And if you're curious to have a look, I have a grading rubric. So for this competition, it is not my subjective taste. I took many, many hours to make a rubric that breaks down what I'm looking for to evaluate, who is the winner. So I hope you'll have a moment to check it out. All right, so some quick remarks about this updated version of my symphony. Notice for the last three chords, it's just simpler, okay? So we just have the woodwinds. Now notice that it's not that far from the original conception with the woodwinds, I've just took things out. So don't be discouraged. You may have a really good hunch with your first attempt. I also have the glockenspiel, which I had in the first version, I think. In the three measures prior, notice I took out the woodwinds. All right. So I took out the woodwinds. So when the woodwinds come in, they sound super fresh. You cannot overestimate this effect. It is just instantly powerful. Right. So I guess everything has its excesses. Notice with the strings and the brass. So obviously I'm looking for this darker orchestration. Notice that the trombone too is now doubling the cellos. And we have this nice color of the trombone with the cello in that range. Really nice match right there. Notice I have the French horns, and they're kind of filling in the texture, between the violin 2 and the viola. If you want to apply the competition, make sure you go ahead to the website and look at the conditions very quickly so you have enough time to do a quality submission. Have a good day.